Montana Territory, 1879. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town of Rimrock, a frontier settlement where hope was as scarce as rainfall. Yates Xavier rode in on his chestnut gelding, dust clinging to his trail-worn clothes. At 25, he already carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd seen too much of the harsh realities the West had to offer. His lean frame was muscled from years of hard riding, his face handsome beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, with only a light stubble darkening his jaw. But it was his eyes, steel blue and watchful, that told the real story. They rarely softened, and never for long. Yates had learned one lesson well in his years drifting from ranch to ranch. The frontier was no place for putting down roots. Men who got attached ended up buried in unmarked graves, or worse, left to watch helplessly as everything they loved was stripped away. Better to keep moving, take work where you could find it, and never let anyone close enough to become a weakness. The cowboy life suited him just fine, lonely but safe. The only attachments worth having were to a good horse and a reliable gun. He'd come to Rimrock on word of work at the Double Circle Ranch. Times were hard everywhere, and a man with his skills could name his price if he found the right outfit desperate enough for experienced hands. What he hadn't counted on was the town being even smaller than rumor had it, one main street, a handful of businesses, and not much else. He'd need supplies before heading out to the ranch, so he dismounted outside the general store, tying his horse to the hitching post. The bell above the door jingled as Yates entered, his spurs making a soft chiming sound against the wooden floor. The store was neat but sparsely stocked, telling the story of the hard times that had hit the territory. Behind the counter stood a young woman whose beauty hit him like a physical force. She couldn't have been more than 22, with honey-blonde hair pulled back in a simple bun, tendrils escaping to frame a face that belonged in a painting. Her blue calico dress was modest and practical, but couldn't hide the graceful lines of her figure. What struck him most, though, were her eyes, green as spring grass but carrying a shadow of sorrow that seemed too heavy for someone so young. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Yates cleared his throat. "Just passing through. Need some supplies before heading out to the Double Circle." Something flickered in those green eyes. "You're looking for work there?" He nodded, suddenly aware of the trail dust on his clothes. "Yes, ma'am." "Heard they were hiring." "They are." She paused, studying him with an intensity that made him want to shift his feet. "I'm Serena Dawson." "Yates Xavier," he replied with a slight tip of his hat. She nodded, then turned to gather the supplies he'd need without him having to ask, moving with practiced efficiency. It wasn't until she was wrapping up his purchases that he noticed the simple gold band on her left hand and another on a chain around her neck. "Your husband runs the store?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. A shadow passed over her face. "My husband built it. Thomas was killed by rustlers last winter." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Yates felt a familiar wall go up inside him. This woman's sorrow wasn't his burden to share. Yet he found himself saying, "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am." Serena squared her shoulders slightly. "Thank you. The Double Circle was his dream." "I've been trying to keep it going since," she trailed off, then continued with forced practicality. "But I can't do it alone. That's why I've been hiring hands." Yates stared at her, the pieces falling into place. "You own the Double Circle?" "Yes, Thomas and I started it together 3 years ago." "It's not much yet, but it's mine now." Pride and determination flashed across her face. "His cousin's been helping, but he's heading back east next month. I need someone who knows cattle and can handle himself." Yates felt a warning bell sound in his mind. Working for a woman was one thing. Working for a young widow struggling to hold on to her land was another matter entirely. That was a complication he didn't need, the kind that pulled a man into other people's troubles, into caring what happened to them. "I'll think on it," he said finally, paying for his supplies. "The offer's there," she replied, wrapping his purchases in brown paper. $5 more a month than any other spread is paying." That got his attention. $5 was $5 after all. "I'll ride out tomorrow, take a look." As Yates left the store, he tried to shake off the unsettling feeling that had come over him. He'd learned long ago that entanglements led to pain. The West was too harsh, too unforgiving for anything else. A young widow trying to hold onto a ranch alone was exactly the kind of situation smart men avoided. It wasn't his problem that she'd been left to face the frontier's cruelties on her own. Yet as he mounted his horse and headed toward the town's small hotel, he found himself thinking of those determined green eyes and wondering what sort of woman believed she could stand against all the forces, both natural and human, that would try to take what was hers. The next morning dawned clear and bright as Yates rode out to the double circle. The ranch lay nestled in a valley with a creek running through it, good water, good grass. It wasn't large, maybe 100 head of cattle at most, but the land had potential. As he approached the main house, he saw it was a modest but sturdy cabin with a barn and corral nearby. A bunkhouse stood a short distance away, though from the looks of it, there weren't many hands to fill it. Serena emerged from the house as he dismounted, wearing a worn riding skirt and jacket, her hair braided down her back. Up close, in the morning light, she looked even younger, the weight of her responsibilities etched in the tight set of her mouth. "Mr. Xavier," she acknowledged with a nod. "You came." "Said I would." He glanced around the property. "Place looks solid enough." "It is," pride crept into her voice. "Thomas chose well when he staked our claim. The creek never runs dry, and the valley protects the herd from the worst of the winter storms." She showed him around, speaking knowledgeably about the operation. It became clear that this wasn't just her husband's ranch. She knew every inch of it, understood the cattle business better than most men Yates had worked for. What she lacked was manpower and the physical strength to do certain jobs. "I've got 2 hands left," she explained as they walked. "Good men, but not enough. The rest drifted away after Thomas died. Some thought I'd sell, others," she trailed off, her expression hardening slightly. "Others thought I might be persuaded to marry again for protection." Yates raised an eyebrow. "And you weren't interested?" "In marrying for convenience." "No," she stopped, facing him directly. "I loved my husband, Mr. Xavier. I won't dishonor that by taking another just to make men feel better about a woman running her own ranch." Her directness surprised him. Most women he'd encountered on the frontier were either hardened by its cruelties or broken by them. Serena Dawson seemed to be neither. She carried her grief and determination with equal measure, refusing to be defined by either. "The job's yours if you want it," she said after a moment. $30 a month, room and board. I need someone who can lead the other hands, someone who knows cattle and can handle himself with a gun if needed. It was a good offer, better than most. But something made Yates hesitate. "Why me?" "You don't know anything about me." Serena's green eyes studied him with that same intensity he'd noticed in the store. "I've been watching men come through Rimrock for 3 years, Mr. Xavier. I know the difference between a drifter and a man who's chosen to drift. You're the latter. That tells me you know your business and you've got your reasons for not staying in one place. I don't need to know those reasons. I just need someone who will do the job right for as long as he's here." Her assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Yates found himself nodding slowly. "All right, Mrs. Dawson, you've got yourself a foreman." "For now." A smile briefly transformed her face, lighting up those solemn green eyes. "Thank you. The men will respect you more if you move into the main house. There's a room at the back with its own entrance." Yates stiffened. "That's not necessary. The bunkhouse is fine." "It's not about necessity, Mr. Xavier. It's about appearances. A foreman living with the hands is just another hired man. A foreman with quarters near the owner is someone to be respected." She lifted her chin slightly. "I assure you, your privacy will be respected. I've lived alone since Thomas died. I know how to keep to myself." It was a practical arrangement, even if it made him uneasy. The thought of living under the same roof as Serena Dawson, even with separate entrances, felt dangerously like putting down roots. "Fine," he conceded, "but just until you find someone permanent." She nodded once, the matter settled. "The men will be back from the north pasture this evening. You can meet them then." As Serena walked back toward the house, Yates found himself watching her, the straight back, the determined stride, the way the morning sun caught in her honey-blonde hair. A young widow facing the frontier alone was either very brave or very foolish. Time would tell which Serena Dawson was. For now, he had work to do. And if he did his job right, he'd be moving on before he had to find out. The next few weeks settled into a rhythm. Yates took charge of the daily operations, working alongside the other hands, a grizzled older cowboy named Pete and a younger man called Emmett. They were good men who clearly respected Serena, though they seemed relieved to have another man giving the orders. The work was straightforward: mending fences, tending the small herd, preparing for the upcoming cattle drive to the railhead in Helena. What wasn't straightforward was living in such close proximity to Serena Dawson. Though they maintained a proper distance, she took her meals earlier than the men and spent evenings in her parlor while Yates kept to his room or sat outside. He found himself increasingly aware of her presence. The sound of her moving about the kitchen before dawn, the scent of coffee she brewed each morning, the quiet humming he sometimes heard when she thought no one was listening. One evening, about 3 weeks after his arrival, Yates returned from checking the herd to find Serena struggling with a leaking roof. Spring rains had found a weakness in the cabin's shingles, and she was attempting to place a bucket under the steady drip while water soaked through her sleeve. Without thinking, he crossed the room and took the bucket from her hands. "Let me." Their fingers brushed and something like electricity shot through him. She stepped back quickly, wrapping her arms around herself. "Thank you. I've been meaning to fix that, but with everything else." "I'll take care of it tomorrow," he said, setting the bucket properly. "The roof's no job for," he caught himself before saying a woman, seeing the flash in her eyes. "For one person," he amended. "Takes at least 2 to do it right." She relaxed slightly. "Thank you, I appreciate it." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the steady drip of water into the bucket. Yates noticed a framed photograph on the mantel, Serena with a tall, broad-shouldered man, both smiling. Thomas Dawson, he presumed. "He looks like he was a good man," Yates said before he could stop himself. Serena followed his gaze to the photograph. "He was." She moved to stand before it, touching the frame lightly. "We were childhood sweethearts back in Pennsylvania, came west together when we were barely more than children ourselves. Everyone said we were fools." "Were you?" The question slipped out unbidden. A sad smile touched her lips. "Maybe, but we were happy fools. Thomas believed in this place and what we could build here. He used to say that the frontier didn't care who you were before, only what you were willing to become." Yates thought about that as he climbed onto the roof the next morning, Emmett helping from below. The frontier had certainly changed him, hardened him in ways he sometimes didn't recognize. He'd come west at 18, full of dreams not unlike Thomas Dawson's, only to watch them die one by one in the face of the territory's harsh realities. Serena brought them water as they worked, shielding her eyes against the sun as she looked up at them. "How bad is it?" she called. "Not terrible," Yates replied, securing another shingle. "Should hold through next winter if we finish this section." She nodded, then hesitated. "Mr. Xavier, I wanted to thank you. The ranch is running smoother than it has since Thomas died." Something in her sincere gratitude made him uncomfortable. He wasn't doing anything special, just the job she paid him for. "It's good work," he said simply. "You've built something worth keeping." The smile she gave him then was different from any he'd seen before, unguarded, lighting up her entire face. It hit him like a physical force, and he nearly lost his footing on the roof. "Careful up there," she called, a hint of teasing in her voice. "I can't afford to lose another good man." The words were innocent enough, but they lodged somewhere deep in Yates' chest, a reminder of all he'd sworn to avoid. Getting attached, becoming someone worth losing, those were luxuries the frontier didn't allow, not for men like him. Yet as spring turned to summer and the ranch flourished under their combined efforts, Yates found it increasingly difficult to maintain the distance he'd always kept. Serena wasn't like anyone he'd met before. She faced each day's challenges with quiet determination, never complaining even when exhaustion was evident in the slump of her shoulders or the shadows under her eyes. She worked alongside the men when needed, kept the books with meticulous care, and somehow still found time to tend a small vegetable garden behind the house. One evening, as Yates sat on the porch cleaning his rifle, she emerged from the house and hesitantly took a seat in the chair beside him. "Mr. Xavier," she began, then stopped herself. "Yates, may I call you Yates? It seems silly to be so formal after all these months." He nodded, surprised at how much he liked the sound of his name on her lips. "Of course, Mrs. Dawson." "Serena," she corrected with a small smile. "Fair's fair." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the sun sink below the mountains in the distance. The evening air was cool and sweet with the scent of wildflowers. "I've been thinking about the cattle drive," she said finally. "I'd like to go with you to Helena." Yates turned to her in surprise. "That's not necessary. Emmett, Pete, and I can handle it." "I know you can. But I need to negotiate with the buyers myself. Thomas always said that's where the real money is made or lost." She looked at him directly. "Besides, it's my herd, my responsibility." There was a quiet pride in her voice that made argument difficult. Still, a cattle drive was no place for a woman, especially one as young and, he had to admit, beautiful as Serena. The railhead towns were rough places, full of men who'd spent too long on the trail with nothing but their own company. "It'll be dangerous," he warned, "not just the drive itself, but Helena. It's not like Rimrock." She raised an eyebrow. "I'm not naive, Yates, I know what it's like. I went with Thomas every year." Of course she had. He should have known she wouldn't be the type to stay safely at home while her husband did the difficult work. That knowledge only increased his reluctance to have her along. The thought of Serena facing the dangers of the trail, and the even greater dangers of men who might see a young widow as fair game, made something protective rise in him. "If you're determined to go, then we'll make it work," he conceded finally. "But you'll have to follow my lead when it comes to safety." A satisfied smile touched her lips. "Of course. You're the foreman, after all." As she rose to go back inside, her hand briefly rested on his shoulder, the lightest of touches, gone almost before he registered it. But the warmth of it lingered long after she disappeared into the house. Yates remained on the porch, troubled by his own reaction. He'd spent years keeping people at arm's length, protecting himself from the pain of loss that seemed inevitable in this harsh land. But somehow, without his noticing, Serena Dawson had begun to breach those carefully constructed walls. He found himself thinking of her smile when she thought no one was watching, the determination in her eyes when faced with a challenge, the gentle way she spoke to her horse. It was dangerous territory, more treacherous than any mountain pass or river crossing. Caring for someone in a place like this was asking for heartbreak, even if he allowed himself to acknowledge the growing feelings for Serena, which he wouldn't, what could come of it. She was still grieving her husband, still wore his ring around her neck. And Yates was still a drifter at heart, a man who'd learned the hard way that the frontier was no place for lasting happiness. Better to focus on the cattle drive ahead, do the job he was paid to do. And when it was finished, maybe it would be time to move on before these unwelcome feelings took any stronger hold. The cattle drive began 2 weeks later, with 40 head of prime beef cattle heading for the railhead at Helena. Serena rode alongside Yates at the head of the herd, dressed in practical riding clothes, her honey-blonde hair braided and tucked under a wide-brimmed hat. She sat her horse with easy confidence, clearly no stranger to long days in the saddle. The first few days passed without incident, the cattle moving steadily along the trail Yates had mapped out. They crossed streams and navigated rocky passes, making good time under clear summer skies. Each night they made camp early, taking turns standing watch while the others slept under the stars. It was during these quiet evenings that the barriers between them began to lower. With nothing but the crackling fire and the vast, star-strewn sky above them, conversation came more easily than it ever had at the ranch. "How long have you been riding the range?" Serena asked one night as they sat by the fire, the others already asleep nearby. Yates poured another cup of coffee before answering. "Since I was 16, Left home in Ohio when my father remarried after my mother died. Figured the West had more opportunities for a boy with nothing but a strong back. And did it, her green eyes reflected the dancing flames, watching him with genuine interest. He shrugged, found work easy enough, learned to handle cattle, horses, learned to handle myself. He didn't mention the other lessons, the harder ones about trust and loss and survival. But you never settled anywhere. The question was innocent, but it probed at old wounds. Never found a reason to, he said finally. The frontier's always changing. Seems foolish to put down roots in shifting sand. Serena was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Thomas used to say something similar when we first arrived. He was afraid of building something only to lose it. A sad smile touched her lips. The irony is that's exactly what happened. He built our ranch, our life, and then he was gone. Yates watched the play of emotions across her face. Grief, yes, but something else too. Acceptance, perhaps. Do you regret coming west with him? No, her answer was immediate and certain. Not for a moment. We had 3 wonderful years together, more happiness than some people find in a lifetime. She touched the ring that hung around her neck. The frontier takes, Yates, but it gives too if you're brave enough to accept both. Her words stayed with him as he took the first watch, sitting with his rifle across his knees while the others slept. The night was peaceful, the only sounds the occasional lowing of cattle and the distant cry of a coyote. Above him, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small human dramas played out beneath them. Was Serena right? Had he been so focused on what the frontier could take that he'd refused to see what it might give? The thought was uncomfortable, challenging beliefs he'd held for years. Better not to dwell on it. Better to focus on the job at hand, getting the cattle and Serena safely to Helena. But as the days passed and they drew closer to their destination, Yates found himself increasingly aware of how this drive would mark an ending. Once the cattle were sold, the money secured, there would be no reason for him to stay on at the Double Circle. Other ranches would be hiring for the fall roundup. He could move on, as he always had. The thought brought none of the usual relief. Instead, he found himself watching Serena as she rode beside him, noting the way the sun brought out gold highlights in her hair, the quiet competence with which she handled every challenge. The idea of riding away from her, of never again seeing those green eyes light up with determination or soft humor, left an unexpected hollow feeling in his chest. On the 5th day, disaster struck. They were navigating a narrow pass when a rattlesnake spooked one of the lead steers. The animal bolted, causing a chain reaction that threatened to turn into a full stampede. Yates shouted orders, sending Pete and Emmett to the sides of the herd, while he and Serena raced to get ahead of the panicking cattle. They managed to turn the herd, preventing a stampede, but in the confusion, Serena's horse stepped into a prairie dog hole. The animal went down hard, throwing her clear but landing partially on her leg before scrambling up. Yates' heart nearly stopped as he saw her fall. He was off his horse and at her side in seconds, fear gripping him more tightly than he'd ever experienced. Serena, his hands hovered over her, afraid to move her if something was broken. "Where are you hurt?" She grimaced, trying to sit up. "My leg, I don't think it's broken, but," she gasped as she tried to move it. Relief that she was conscious warred with concern over her injury. Gently, he helped her to a sitting position, then carefully examined her leg. It was already swelling at the ankle, likely sprained rather than broken, but still serious enough to prevent her from riding. "We need to make camp," he decided, looking up to where Pete and Emmett had managed to settle the herd. "You can't ride with that ankle." Serena's face tightened with frustration. "We don't have time to stop. The buyer's expecting us the day after tomorrow." "The buyer can wait," Yates said firmly. "You need rest and that ankle needs tending." For a moment she looked as though she might argue, but then pain won out over stubbornness. She nodded, allowing him to help her to her feet, or rather, to her good foot. Without thinking, Yates swept her up into his arms, carrying her to where their supplies were packed on the trail horses. She was lighter than he expected, fitting against his chest as if she belonged there. Her arm went around his neck for balance, and he caught the scent of her hair, somehow still smelling of wildflowers despite days on the dusty trail. It took every ounce of his willpower to set her down gently on a bedroll rather than continuing to hold her close. "Thank you," she murmured, a flush coloring her cheeks as she arranged her skirts. "I'm not usually so careless." It wasn't carelessness. These things happen on a drive. He busied himself with getting supplies to tend her injury, trying to ignore the lingering feeling of her in his arms. By the time he'd cleaned and wrapped her ankle, Pete and Emmett had the cattle settled and a campsite established. The sun was setting, painting the surrounding hills in gold and crimson. Yates helped Serena to a comfortable spot near the fire, propping her injured ankle on his rolled-up jacket. "We'll rest here tomorrow," he told the others. "Let Mrs. Dawson's ankle heal a bit before we continue." He ignored Serena's look of protest. "We're making good time. One day won't matter." Later, as Emmett and Pete slept and Yates sat keeping watch, Serena's voice came softly from where she lay by the fire. "You were right to make us stop. I was being stubborn." He glanced over at her, surprised by the admission. "Stubborn isn't always bad. Got you this far, hasn't it?" A small smile curved her lips. "I suppose it has." She shifted slightly, wincing as the movement jarred her ankle. "I've had to be stubborn. When Thomas died, everyone expected me to sell the ranch, go back east to my parents, or marry again. No one believed I could make it work on my own." "But you did," Yates said quietly. "You're doing it." She looked at him, the firelight catching in her eyes. "Not alone. I couldn't have managed these past months without you, Yates." The simple statement lodged somewhere deep in his chest, warm and uncomfortable all at once. He wasn't used to being needed, to being acknowledged as something more than a hired hand. It made him feel both powerful and terrifyingly vulnerable. "You'd have found someone else," he said finally. "No," the certainty in her voice made him look up. "Not like you." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was ready to articulate. Yates felt a pull toward her that had nothing to do with physical proximity, and everything to do with the person she was. Brave, determined, honest in a way few people on the frontier allowed themselves to be. But the old fears still whispered in the back of his mind. The frontier was no place for attachments. People left, people died. Better to keep moving than to build something only to lose it. "Try to get some rest," he said, deliberately changing the subject. "We've still got a long way to go." Serena held his gaze a moment longer, something like disappointment flickering in her eyes before she nodded and settled back on her bedroll. "Good night, Yates." "Good night, Serena." He watched as she eventually drifted into sleep, her face softened in the firelight, looking younger and somehow more vulnerable. An unexpected tenderness welled up in him, along with a fierce protectiveness. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was falling in love with Serena Dawson. The thought should have sent him running for the horizon. Instead, he remained where he was, watching over her sleep and wondering when exactly the frontier had stopped feeling like a place to escape to and started feeling like a place where something, or someone, might be worth staying for. The next day, Serena's ankle was still swollen but less painful. She insisted they continue the drive, promising to ride in the chuck wagon rather than on horseback. Yates reluctantly agreed, knowing they couldn't afford many more delays if they were to make their appointment with the buyer. They reached Helena 2 days later, driving the cattle into the stockyards as the afternoon sun beat down on the bustling railhead town. Helena was a far cry from sleepy Rimrock, streets crowded with wagons and riders, saloons doing brisk business despite the early hour, the constant whistle and rumble of trains at the nearby depot. Yates helped Serena down from the wagon, noting with relief that she could put some weight on her ankle now. "I'll get us rooms at the hotel," he said, eyeing the crowds with concern. "Then we can meet with the buyer in the morning." She nodded, looking around with the air of someone reacquainting herself with a half-forgotten place. The Northwestern Hotel should have space. Thomas and I always stayed there. The mention of her husband was a needed reminder for Yates. Whatever feelings he might be developing for Serena, she was still a widow grieving the man she'd loved. The ring around her neck was proof enough of that. They secured rooms at the Northwestern, a decent establishment that catered to cattle buyers and the better class of travelers. After cleaning up from the trail, they met in the hotel dining room for supper. Serena had changed into a simple but becoming dress of deep blue, her honey-blonde hair neatly arranged. The transformation from trail rider to lady was startling, reminding Yates of the many facets of this remarkable woman. "The buyer will meet us at 9 tomorrow," she said as they ate. "His name is Richardson. He's fair but drives a hard bargain." Yates nodded, impressed as always by her knowledge of the business. "Do you have a price in mind?" $20 a head minimum, 25 would be better. The herd's in good condition despite the drive. She took a sip of her coffee, then added, "I'd like you to be there. Richardson might try to take advantage if he thinks I'm negotiating alone." The request warmed him, though he tried not to show it. "Of course, that's what you pay me for." Something flickered in her eyes, disappointment perhaps. "Yes, of course." They finished their meal in silence, an awkwardness between them that hadn't been there before. As they rose to leave, Serena suddenly swayed, her face paling as she put weight on her injured ankle. Yates was at her side instantly, his arm going around her waist to steady her. "Easy. You've been pushing too hard." She leaned into him, her hand gripping his arm. "I'm fine, just stood up too quickly." They were close, closer than they'd been since he'd carried her after the fall. He could see the individual lashes surrounding those green eyes, count the faint freckles across her nose from days in the sun. Something changed in her expression as she looked up at him, a softening, a question. For one breathless moment, Yates thought he might kiss her. Wanted to, with an intensity that shocked him. Her lips parted slightly, as if she'd read his mind and wasn't opposed to the idea. The sound of the dining room door opening broke the spell. Yates stepped back, his hands falling away from her waist as a group of cattlemen entered, talking loudly amongst themselves. "You should rest," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Big day tomorrow." Serena nodded, composing herself with visible effort. "Yes, good night, Yates." He watched her make her way carefully up the stairs, fighting the urge to follow, to offer his arm or even carry her again. But the moment, whatever it had been, had passed. Better that way, he told himself, better for both of them. Morning brought clearer heads and the business at hand. Yates accompanied Serena to the buyer's office, a small but well-appointed room near the stockyards. Mr. Richardson proved to be exactly as Serena had described, fair but shrewd, clearly hoping to take advantage of what he perceived as an inexperienced widow. His attitude changed quickly when he realized Serena knew exactly what her cattle were worth and wouldn't be pressured into accepting less. Yates said little, but his presence seemed to lend weight to her arguments. In the end, they settled on $23 a head, a good price that would see the double circle through the winter with some to spare. "Your husband trained you well, Mrs. Dawson," Richardson remarked as he counted out the payment. The condescension in his tone made Yates' jaw tighten. Serena accepted the money with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Actually, Mr. Richardson, I kept the books from the beginning. Thomas always said I had a better head for figures than he did." They left with the payment safely secured, stepping out into the bustling street. Yates couldn't help but admire the way she'd handled herself, confident without being aggressive, knowledgeable without being overbearing. "That went well," he said as they walked back toward the hotel. "You're good at this." A genuine smile lit up her face at the compliment. "Thank you. It feels good to know I can do this part too, not just keep the ranch running." The rest of the day was spent taking care of business matters, supplies to order for the ranch, arrangements for the men's pay, a telegraph sent to the double circle letting them know the sale was successful. By evening, everything was settled, leaving them with a free day before beginning the journey home. "We should celebrate," Serena suggested as they finished another quiet dinner at the hotel. "The sale was better than I'd hoped for." Yates raised an eyebrow. "Celebrate how? Helena's not exactly known for its refined entertainment." A mischievous light entered her eyes, making her look younger, carefree in a way he rarely saw. "There's a dance at the community hall tonight. Nothing fancy, but it might be fun. unless you don't dance." The challenge in her voice made him smile despite himself. "I dance just fine, Mrs. Dawson. Though I didn't pack my best boots for a cattle drive." "Neither did I," she laughed, "but I haven't danced in a very long time." There was a wistfulness in her voice that made it impossible to refuse. "Then I guess we're going to a dance." The community hall was crowded when they arrived, lanterns casting a warm glow over the proceedings. A small band played in the corner, fiddle, guitar, and piano creating lively music that had several couples already spinning around the floor. It wasn't a fancy affair, but there was a festive air about it, a chance for people to forget the frontier's hardships for an evening. Serena drew glances as they entered, her simple blue dress setting off her fair coloring, her honey-blonde hair arranged in a becoming style. She wasn't the most elaborately dressed woman there, but to Yates' eyes she was easily the most beautiful. "May I have this dance?" he asked formally, offering his hand. Her smile was answer enough as she placed her fingers in his. The music was a lively reel, and despite her still tender ankle, Serena moved with natural grace. Yates found himself smiling more than he had in years as they spun around the floor, her laughter like music over the fiddle's notes. When the tempo changed to a slower waltz, he hesitated, suddenly aware of how much closer they would need to be. But Serena stepped into his arms without hesitation, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as his found her waist. "You dance very well, Mr. Xavier," she said as they moved in perfect time to the music. "So do you, Mrs. Dawson." He guided her carefully around a more enthusiastic couple. "Though we should be careful of your ankle. It's much better." Besides, her eyes held his, candlelight reflecting in their green depths. "Some things are worth a little pain." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the dance. Yates found himself holding her a fraction closer, his hand at her waist more certain in its pressure. She fit against him perfectly, as if they'd been dancing together for years instead of minutes. "Serena," he began, not entirely sure what he meant to say but knowing he needed to say something. "Yes." Her eyes never left his, open and vulnerable in a way that made his heart twist. But before he could continue, the music ended, and the moment with it. Other dancers moved around them, breaking the private world they'd briefly inhabited. They danced several more times throughout the evening, but that perfect connection wasn't quite recaptured. Still, as they walked back to the hotel under the star-strewn sky, Serena's hand resting lightly on his arm, Yates felt a contentment he hadn't experienced in years. At her door she turned to face him, her expression serious in the dim hallway light. "Thank you for tonight, for everything, really. The drive wouldn't have been successful without you." "You'd have managed," he said, though he was pleased by her gratitude. "Perhaps, but I'm glad I didn't have to." She hesitated, then added softly, "Will you be staying on at the double circle when we get back?" The question hit at the heart of the conflict he'd been avoiding. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to take his pay and move on, find another ranch where he wouldn't be in danger of caring too much, of becoming something that could be lost. But looking at Serena now, her face open and hopeful, Yates found he couldn't give the answer that had always come so easily before. "I'd like to," he said finally, "at least through the winter. If you'll have me." Her smile was like sunrise after a long night. "I'd like that very much." On impulse he reached out and took her hand, bringing it briefly to his lips in a gesture more suited to a formal parlor than a hotel hallway. "Good night, Serena." "Good night, Yates." Her fingers lingered in his for a moment before she slipped into her room, the door closing softly behind her. Yates stood there longer than necessary, staring at the closed door and wondering if he'd just made the best decision of his life or the worst. The frontier had taught him that caring led to pain, that attachments were dangerous. But it had also brought him to Serena Dawson, a woman who faced the same harsh realities he did yet somehow hadn't let them harden her heart. Maybe, just maybe, she was right. Maybe the frontier took, but it gave too, if you were brave enough to accept both. The journey back to the double circle was uneventful, though it felt different somehow. Something had shifted between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of possibilities neither was quite ready to name. They talked more easily, shared stories of their pasts, discovered common ground despite their different upbringings. Yates found himself telling her things he'd never shared with anyone, about his mother's death when he was 14, his difficult relationship with his father, the dreams that had drawn him west and the realities that had nearly crushed them. Serena listened without judgment, offering her own stories in return, her sheltered childhood in Pennsylvania, her parents' opposition to her marriage to Thomas, the hard but rewarding years building the ranch together. As the double circle came into view on the horizon, Yates felt an unexpected sense of homecoming. The small ranch house with its sturdy barn and corrals, the creek winding through green pastures, the distant mountains standing guard, it all looked right somehow, as if he'd been seeing it through a fog before and now could appreciate its true beauty. Serena must have sensed his thoughts. "It looks different coming home, doesn't it? Thomas always said the best view of the ranch was the one you got returning to it." He was right. Yates glanced at her profile, struck again by her quiet strength. "You've built something good here." "We're still building," she corrected softly, "all of us." The simple inclusion, the we that encompassed him along with the ranch and its future, settled somewhere deep in Yates' chest, warming him from the inside out. The weeks that followed were busy ones as they prepared for winter. Hay needed to be cut and stored, buildings reinforced against the coming snows, the herd moved to more sheltered pastures. Yates threw himself into the work with newfound purpose, no longer just doing a job but helping to secure a future. The fact that he could now imagine himself as part of that future both terrified and exhilarated him. Serena worked alongside everyone, her quiet leadership earning respect from the hands and from the neighboring ranchers who had once doubted her ability to keep the double circle going. More than once, Yates caught her watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, a thoughtful expression on her face that made his heart beat faster. One evening in late October, with the first dusting of snow on the distant peaks, Yates sat on the porch cleaning his rifle as had become his habit. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine from the hills and wood smoke from the chimney. Serena joined him, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. She held out a cup of coffee, which he accepted gratefully. "Winter's coming early this year," she observed, settling into the chair beside him. "Pete says the squirrels are gathering extra nuts, which means heavy snow." Yates nodded. "The cattle are in good condition. They'll weather it fine in the south pasture." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. It was Serena who finally spoke, her voice soft but determined. "Yates, there's something I need to say." She turned to face him fully, her green eyes serious in the gathering darkness. "When Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over. I never expected to feel, to find." She paused, searching for words. Yates set his rifle aside, his full attention on her face. "Serena, please let me finish." She took a deep breath. "The day you rode into Rimrock, I saw something in you, not just a good cowhand or a man who knew his business. I saw someone who understood the frontier the way I did, as something that could break you or make you stronger, depending on how you faced it." Her hand moved to the ring she wore around her neck, Thomas's ring. With deliberate care, she unfastened the chain and held it in her palm, looking at it as if seeing it for the first time. "I've worn this since the day we buried him. It was my way of holding on, of keeping faith with the life we'd built." She looked up at Yates, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But Thomas wouldn't want me to stop living. He'd want me to be happy, to find someone who could share the dream we started." Slowly she rose and moved to the porch railing, looking out at the land they'd both come to love. "I'll always love Thomas. He'll always be part of who I am, part of this ranch." She turned back to face Yates. "But my heart has room for more than memories, if you wanted to stay, not just as my foreman but as something more, if you wanted to build something here together." She left the sentence unfinished, vulnerable and brave all at once. Yates stood, crossing the porch to stand before her. All the barriers he'd built, all the fears that had kept him moving from place to place, seemed insignificant in the face of what Serena was offering. Not just love, but a home, a future, a place where he truly belonged. "I've spent my whole life running," he admitted quietly. Telling myself that the frontier was no place for putting down roots, for letting yourself care too much. I was wrong. He reached out, gently taking the ring and chain from her palm. With the same reverence she had shown, he placed it in her pocket, then took both her hands in his. I love you, Serena Dawson. I think I started falling the day I walked into your store, though I was too stubborn to admit it. A smile touched his lips. Seems we're well matched in stubbornness, at least. She laughed softly, tears spilling onto her cheeks. Is that a yes, you'll stay? It's more than that. He drew her closer, his heart fuller than he'd ever thought possible. I'm done running. Whatever comes, good or bad, easy or hard, I want to face it with you. Here, on this land we both love. Serena's smile was radiant as she reached up to touch his face. Then welcome home, Yates Xavier. When their lips finally met, it felt like coming home in the truest sense, not to a place, but to a person. The kiss deepened, years of loneliness and fear melting away in the warmth of newfound love. The frontier had taken much from both of them, but in bringing them together, it had given something infinitely precious in return. They were married that winter, in a small ceremony at the Rimrock church. The ranch flourished under their joint care, growing in the years that followed as they added more land, more cattle, and eventually, children who grew up strong and sure in the legacy their parents had built. The frontier remained what it had always been, beautiful and harsh, generous and cruel by turns. But Yates and Serena faced it together, finding in each other the strength to weather its storms and the joy to celebrate its gifts. What had begun as a simple act of help, a cowboy assisting a struggling widow, had become something neither could have imagined, a love story as vast and enduring as the western sky above them. In the years that followed, travelers passing by the double circle would often remark on the obvious affection between the rancher and his wife, the way they worked side by side as equals, the respect and tenderness evident in every interaction. Few knew the full story of how they came together, how a man who believed the frontier was no place for love found himself proved gloriously wrong by a woman brave enough to open her heart twice. But those who knew them best understood that their love was built on something stronger than romance alone, on shared values, mutual respect, and the courage to embrace both the giving and taking of frontier life. Together they had created something rare and precious, not just a successful ranch, but a true home where love and hope flourished despite the hardships that surrounded them. And in the end, that was the greatest adventure of all.